So tonight we'll be looking at the book of Daniel, and taking a mad dash to it in some sense. But it's nice to have a few hours to be able to look at it. I'd like to begin, though, talking about apocalyptic literature and what it is. Daniel's been identified as apocalyptic literature. I think, in some sense, that could even be debated now. And the reason I say that is, in my view, the category of apocalyptic literature is modern-day scholars looking backwards. I don't know that Daniel was thinking, I'm going to write apocalyptic literature. And a lot of the basis of viewing Daniel as apocalyptic literature comes from the fact that in later years, people did imitate his style. And it's been categorized as apocalyptic literature amongst some of the intertestamental literature and some of the non-biblical literature. There was a lot of non-biblical apocalyptic documents written. And many of these were found at Qumran. And it was a more apocalyptic community that was waiting for the coming of Messiah and the cataclysmic end of the age and all these kinds of things. And so they took what these guys did, and I think they've generally read it backwards into the biblical text. Now, that being said, there are some characteristics of apocalyptic literature that are true of Daniel, of Revelation, of Ezekiel, of Joel, of several of these books. They say in Isaiah there's this little mini apocalypse and things like that. So let's talk about characteristics of apocalyptic literature. And as prophetic literature, what we categorize as apocalyptic literature, and I think that's the way to think about it. What our modern scholarship has decided is apocalyptic literature, is different in four ways from regular prophetic literature. And remember, what was one of the main characteristics of Isaiah and Jeremiah in terms of writing style as literature? Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel.
Poetry.
Yeah, poetry. They're almost pure poetry. Well, one of the first characteristics of apocalyptic literature is that it's prose, not poetry. So when you hit a prose section in prophetic literature, one of the things is, the questions you ask is this apocalyptic literature? A second characteristic of apocalyptic literature that you don't see as much in regular prophetic literature, although you do see some of it, and that is symbolism. Apocalyptic literature is characterized by wild symbolism at times, but a lot of symbolic language. Now, that being said, my own conviction is this, is that even though it's symbolism, even though they bring up a symbol, a lion standing on its hind feet, eagle wings, there is a reality behind that symbol. And when we're interpreting apocalyptic literature, we're trying to figure out what the literal behind the figurative is. So each symbol has a literal meaning behind it. It is symbolizing something. And we'll look at some of these in Daniel. And so there is that, and one of our challenges as interpreters is to figure out what it is. And sometimes clues will come from things like the history of the day. For example, when we talk about the bear, it's not Russia. It's Persia. Why? Because that was the symbol that they had for themselves at that time. So in Daniel's day, everyone would recognize it. I know what he's talking about. And now, the confusion comes because of the bear of the north and Russia and all these kinds of things in modern times. But there is a literal behind each symbol. A third characteristic of apocalyptic literature is that you will have some kind of angelic interpreter. Unlike regular prophecy where there is no interpretation, the prophet just simply gives out his poem and he's the one telling you what it is. Here you'll have this vision with these wild symbols, and then an angel will come along and interpret it for the author. And then the fourth characteristic of apocalyptic literature is it always deals with the last days. It always deals with end-time issues. Whereas regular prophecy deals with history mostly throughout time. Now that creates some problems because of Daniel's apocalyptic literature. Why is chapters 11 and 12 all about the intertestamental period, unless the end of the age has come? We just didn't know about it. Well, so again, this is the definition of apocalyptic literature that you'll find in the literature, but you'll notice that neither Daniel nor Revelation really follow all the rules as such. But they're sort of like that. The non-biblical apocalyptic literature had these same traits. It was prose, there was a lot of symbolism, there would be an angelic interpreter, and it was always having to do with the coming of Messiah and the end of the age. Now, the difference is this, well, actually in some ways it's not so different. The non-biblical apocalyptic literature was really written to promote certain theological or philosophical ideas. And so it was really a genre of literature to communicate an idea. And their philosophy, if you want to think of it that way, or their theology. And it was a conventional way of writing. And these apocalyptic tomes would they attach it to it the name of one of the prophets to make it sound more legitimate, and all of that. So they were that way. Now, again, Daniel, Revelation, Ezekiel, they also have messages. They also have messages to communicate, and they use these means to do it. But there is a difference, and that is these really are visions from God that they're reporting. And God chose this mode to communicate certain future historical truths. And so there is the difference there.
So it's not their interpretation.
That's right.
It's his enactment or whatever.
That's right. It's his enactment, and it's designed, and I think this is an important thing to understand. Typical prophetic literature, I believe, was designed to be understood. In other words, the audience got the point. I think apocalyptic literature is designed to be recognized when it happens. You know what I mean by that? In other words, the generation who goes through it will go, yeah. They'll understand it. But the generation before may not. And so hindsight with apocalyptic literature is more powerful. But here's the key thing. Those who know the Scriptures, when it happens, recognizes it. One of the reasons why we are studying Scripture is we may enter into the last days. It may be that we are in the last days because my alma mater won their bowl game, so we're in trouble. And the fact that they made it to a bowl game, we're in trouble. But, we could be entering into the last days. And if we are, there may be certain prophecies that's going to characterize that time that we don't recognize at this time as applying to, let's say, the pre-rapture of the church the last 2 years. But they're there. But if we're studying the Scriptures and we recognize it, when it happens, we'll realize the time we're in. That's why, Jesus keeps saying, I'm coming quickly. Well, the quickly has the idea with suddenness more than chronology. But also, we're told in many places to watch and to wait and to beware. Well, if we're being told to watch, there must be something to see. And I think it's sort of like the first coming of Christ. Why did so many people miss him? I mean, they had the Scriptures because they weren't studying them. But there were those who immediately recognized him. Why? Because they knew God's Word and they saw he was the fulfillment of it. And so it was a small number of people, but they were there. They didn't have some special revelation. An angel didn't come and tap him on the shoulder and say, by the way, that's him. I mean, I guess you could say Simeon had the advantage. He'd had a revelation from God that he wasn't going to die till he saw Messiah. So he figured it out. He's coming in my lifetime. He still didn't know what day, but he knew enough that when Jesus' parents walked in, he goes, there he is. And you hear what he says about him, and he clearly knows who he is. Well, that's from knowing God's Word. I find that story fascinating because, then you have Anna, the prophetess, who's there, 80-some-odd years old, and she then gets all excited and runs around and tells everybody. Well, what's she doing there? You ever wonder about that? Did she get some special revelation from the Holy Spirit that said, hey, you better go to the temple, the Messiah's coming today? No, she'd probably been talking to Simeon. He told her about the vision, so she goes, if I hang around this guy, I'll be there when he comes. And that's probably what's going on. Someone who knew God's Word. And so that's an important thing. So with biblical apocalyptic literature, they are historical events that are going to happen. And the symbolism means something. Okay, let's talk about the book of Daniel then. And one of the interesting things about Daniel is how to structure it. What is the literary structure of Daniel? And there's really two options. The first one is the approach that I've taken for years was to divide it based on its content. And when you go by content, there's really two parts to the book. Chapters 1 through 6, and then 7 through 12. 1 through 6, you have a series of historical events where you have the stories of Daniel, his friends, and individual events. Each one of them is really 1 through 6 is a unit talking about something that happened to either Daniel or his three friends. And the message of that first half would be God's control of men. Because in each one you have God sovereignly involved in the life of an individual, whether it's a good guy or a bad guy. Then the second half of Daniel, you have that series of visions. Chapter 7, 8, 9, and then 10 through 12. So you got these 4 visions, and there the message is God's control of history. So you divide Daniel up and you see God's control of men, God's control of history. And 1 through 6, and 7 through 12. But here's the interesting twist to the book of Daniel. It's not all in Hebrew. It is also in Aramaic. Which chapters? 2 through 7. Chapters 2 through 7 are in Aramaic. So some people divide it that way. Chapter 1 is an introduction. Then chapters 2 through 7, you have the theme of God's control of men and history. And then chapters 8 through 12, God's control of history. And it's divided because of the language. And interestingly enough, if you take 2 through 7, it forms a chiasm. Chapter 2 and chapter 7 both have the 4 empires. Chapter 2, you have the vision of the statue. Chapter 7, you have the vision of the 4 beasts.
Why do you think those chapters were written in Aramaic versus Hebrew?
I think Daniel, well, in part because they're from Nebuchadnezzar. And then Daniel chose to do that as a way of people recognizing the universal aspect of it and possibly then to see the chiasm. That would be my guess. But part of it is, I think, because it's part of it is actually written by Nebuchadnezzar himself, that Daniel incorporated in. But you have then 2 and 7, you have those visions. 3 and 5, as you move your way inside the chiasm, chapter 3, you've got fiery furnace, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who are threatened with the fiery furnace because they refuse to worship the king. Chapter 5, guess what? Or 6, guess what it is? It's Daniel in the lion's den because he refused to worship the king. And in both cases, God delivers out of the very danger. Both of them end up, Daniel ends up in the lion's den, they end up in the furnace, and they come out unscathed. Then the middle ones, the 2 middle ones, if you'll notice, 4 and 5, you have chapter 4, which is Nebuchadnezzar being disciplined by God for his pride. Chapter 5, Belshazzar being killed by God for his pride. And so at the very center of the chiasm is God's sovereign control over the most powerful men in the world. That he can discipline them and he can kill them. As you move out from the center of the chiasm, you see he can protect his own, and then further out, you see he controls it. So there does seem to be this clear delineation by Daniel, this purposeful chiasm by Daniel. Now, which of the structures or outlines is best? The two-part outline or the three-part outline? Or, the question I would ask is, did Daniel intend them both? The message doesn't change, because ultimately the point of Daniel is God's in control. Now remember, Daniel's writing this after the Persians have taken Babylon. And after, of course, he's been fed to the lions. And so, in fact, after the first group of Jews have already returned to Palestine. And it's possible that he's writing at a time when not only they have returned to Palestine, but they tried to build the temple, and remember they got stopped after a couple of years. And they're living there in fear of the people around them who are threatening them for their dedication to God. So Daniel may have chosen to write this for their benefit. But also, I think one of his purposes in writing this very likely is so they would know, or God inspired them to do it, because God was letting them know that Messiah's kingdom wasn't coming immediately. I think a lot of the Jews who returned under Zerubbabel were convinced that when they got back and started rebuilding, Messiah was going to come back, and they were going to enter into that time of blessing that Isaiah had promised, and Ezekiel had promised, and Jeremiah had promised, and all this. That once the 70 years were done, they were going to have finished their discipline from God and go on into Messiah's kingdom, and Messiah was going to come. They were sorely disappointed, I'm sure. So Daniel is inspired by God to write this so they would know that no, it's not going to happen next year. In fact, it's not going to happen next generation. Because you think, well, once the Persians are gone, then we'll be free. But the Greeks are coming. And then you're just going to think, well, once the Greeks are gone, then the Messiah will come. Nope. Another kingdom is coming. We know of it as the Romans. And that there were these massive world empires. So that the whole point, or a part of the point of Daniel, is so that the believing Jew in the land would know that God was not done with their history, that God's promises had not failed, and that Messiah is still coming back, and there is still this. And we face that. There are those in the church who say, because nothing has happened in 2,000 years, it's not going to. But we're still waiting for the return of Christ. The angel, as Jesus ascended to heaven, told the disciples, he's coming back the same way he left. Not spiritually. Not in the church. Not reigning from heaven on his throne and the Holy Spirit's ministry in the church. That's not the same way he left. And either that angel was very confused or he's coming back. And so, but they need to hear that too, because we're still waiting. And I've known people who were convinced they were not going to die before Jesus came back. And they're very surprised. Well, they're not surprised anymore because they've been in heaven for several years now. I'm sure it's dawned on them that they didn't make it. And I would love to be raptured, I think. It all depends on if you're indoors or outdoors at the time, right?
I'm afraid of heights.
Well, the big thing is the headache you'll get going through the ceiling. And we look for that day. I would love to experience it, especially before I get old and sick and decrepit and everything. Well, I don't know if I'd mind being decrepit if my mind went along with my body. I might enjoy it. But but we have no guarantee. Jesus may not come back for another 1,000 years. But he may come back next year. I wish we could know when, but we should not do like that one guy did. He was convinced Jesus was coming back, so all these credit card things got sent to him. He applied for them all, got all his credit, and then went and spent to the limit, and then Jesus didn't come back. But he still had to pay it back. He's in big trouble. We need to be careful that we're not foolish. We don't stand on the mountaintop waiting for something to happen. We're supposed to be busy about the task that Jesus has given us till he comes back. And even if we think he's coming back next week, we're still supposed to be busy about the task. And on one hand, we live looking for his return tomorrow, but on the other hand, we're supposed to live wisely and plan for the future. It's a balanced life. So that we don't act foolishly, but also that we don't act irresponsibly towards God. So it's that balance. Well,
is it reasonable to assume that if any one of us died tonight, that it would be like the second coming, wouldn't it? Because
no, I don't think so.
Okay, because I mean, there's people talk like we'll go into the grave and wait in the grave.
Yeah.
And others say no. As soon as you die, you go right to the heavenly places and come back with him.
Yeah.
But doesn't it? The scriptures makes it sound like, it seems to me that the graves are open and the dead rise first.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So it happens at the same time or within a blink. So you could say.
Yeah. Well, there's actually, there are three groups in the rapture of the church that go up. You've heard that. The dead in Christ, of course, they rise first. And us alive in Christ, we rise last. So who's the group in between?
Those who are redeemed.
No, all the deadheads. So, but anyhow, there's our joke for today. But no, 2 Corinthians chapter 5 makes it clear that in the instant that we die, we are present with the Lord spiritually, but our bodies are not, and they will be reunited with our spirits at the rapture. And so there is no soul sleep. Some people teach soul sleep, that while you're in the grave, you're asleep, and then your resurrection at the rapture is as if Jesus came back right then. But no, scriptures are clear that we will be in heaven, and in Revelation it's very clear that even the souls of those beheaded during the Great Tribulation, they are conscious and actively worshiping God in heaven while they're awaiting the resurrection. And so we have conscious existence. In fact, we will be more conscious after we're dead than while we're alive, because we won't have the hindrances of our body and medication and everything else numbing our minds. And we will be awake eternally. I'm convinced there's no sleep in heaven, because there's no night, and there's no fatigue. So we don't need sleep. By the way, what is the only mammal that does not sleep?
Sharks are mammals.
No, sharks aren't mammals.
They do fly first.
Yeah, they do, but they're not. Yeah, they're not. Whales do. I think whales do. Cows don't sleep.
Really?
Yeah, cows don't sleep. That's the weirdest thing.
Still fun to send people out to the pasture for captivity, though. It's still fun to send people out to the pasture for captivity.
Yeah.
To see what happens.
Yeah, that's good. I hadn't thought of that. We should try that with some of our students. Anyhow, so the four kingdoms. In these two visions, you have four kingdoms, and the identity of those four kingdoms is debated between liberals and conservatives. Now, and by the way, when I say this, between liberals and conservatives, amillennialists will agree with premillennialists as conservatives. So when I say liberals and conservatives, I'm not saying premill versus ammill. I'm saying conservatives who see Daniel as being written in the 6th century, after 539, by Daniel himself, versus liberals who sees the book of Daniel being written around 135 BC because of the events recorded in chapters 11 and 12. Okay, so that's the differences between those two groups. Now, the liberal view is that the four metals And the 4 beasts are, number 1,
The kingdom,
the kingdoms.
Babylon.
Yeah, the first one would be Babylon. Everybody agrees Babylon. Both liberal and conservative agrees it's Babylon. Then what's the second kingdom?
Medes.
Yeah. And amongst the liberals, it's the Medes, just the Medes. Amongst conservatives, it's the Medes and the Persians. Now, in history, there was a Median empire that was independent of the Persian Empire. I think it's like 40, 50 years. Now, the Persians did not conquer the Medes. The two empires joined each other. It was a friendly joining. And essentially the way it worked out is the Medes liked the fighting, the conquest, but they didn't really like the administration of the government. Yeah. They just, why waste time running a country when we can just go destroy another? The Medes are modern day,
Iran.
Afghanistan. Modern day Afghanistan. The Persians are modern day Iran. And so the liberals separate the two because they can say in history there was a separate Median empire. So they have the Medes and the Persians. Why do they have it go Babylon, Medes, Persians, Greeks, and no Romans?
Because if you had said Romans, then you'd have to admit that there was some actual prophecy.
That's right. Because the Romans are not on the scene in 135. Now, in reality, Rome has begun to rise. In 135, the city of Rome has become its own city-state. It's beginning to expand its borders, but it's not anywhere near what it's going to be. 100 years later, it's the world empire. But at the time of 135, it's not a significant factor, and it's not even on the horizon from the perspective of the Middle East. So the liberals have to separate things out differently, whereas the conservatives, of course, see the Fourth Empire as the Roman Empire, and we do see it as prophetic. It also helped that the Second and Third Empires are identified in chapter 8 by the angel as the Medo-Persian Empire and the Greek Empire, and so we take that seriously. Now, there are some historical questions around the book, one of which is Nebuchadnezzar's madness, and I think I've given you information on that, right? Is that right?
Yeah.
Okay. And it's been questioned. In fact, it's really fun. All these historical issues have been questioned for years, but the growing evidence is killing the liberals on this. But one is they question, and it's a legitimate question. How can somebody survive if they go insane in that world? Because there was always someone standing in line to bump you off and take over. Ahasuerus, Esther's husband, was bumped off by his son, Artaxerxes. When his son perceived Dad was weak and I'm tired of waiting to be king, he got rid of him. It wasn't a matter of love either. Love or hate, it was practical. He was ready to be in charge. And he got rid of him. And Dad was a drunk. So, not looking, take him out. That's what Absalom tried to do with David. Again, he perceived his weakness. He was vengeful. He went after Dad. Failed, but gave it a good try. King Belshazzar at one time was questioned. But now they have found his name in records. And they know pretty much who he is. There's still some debate as to whether he was an actual son of Nebuchadnezzar or just called that. The basic theory now, that I think is a good one, is that when Nabonidus became king, he married one of the widows of Nebuchadnezzar. Remember, these guys were polygamists. And so they'd have several wives. You remember the situation when, after Solomon becomes king, his brother Adonijah, who was wanting to be king and failed, and was put under house arrest basically, asked permission to marry Abishag, who was the bed warmer for David, the concubine. That, and the text indicated that David never had any sexual relation with her, that she was just simply his bedwoman. At that stage, he was so old he wasn't interested or capable. And so Adonijah asked permission, and Solomon's response is, well, why don't you just ask for the whole kingdom? Why? Because if you're married to the king's widow, you can make a claim to the throne. And so that appears to be what Nabonidus did. And this widow had a son, Belshazzar, who was the son of Nebuchadnezzar, that then Nabonidus basically adopts. And basically when this son grows to age, he'll be the king. So Nabonidus is a temporary king, a transitional king, waiting for the actual heir to grow up and be of age to rule. That would seem to be what the strategy was. Because by the time you have the fall of Babylon, they're in fact serving as co-regents. And that was another common practice in the ancient world, is when a king was getting old, or he felt like his son was ready, or getting a little antsy, you go ahead and bring him on as a co-regent, and so you have the father as the figurehead, and you got the son doing all the work. It's sort of like we do in a lot of colleges now. You got the president, you got the provost. The provost is actually the one doing all the work, and the president does the speeches. And still runs the show. I mean, he tells the provost what to do, but the provost is really the working person that everyone works for. Well, same sort of thing. You have those. Hezekiah, in fact, was a co-regent with his dad, Ahaz, for a while. If you remember when Uzziah came down with leprosy, his son Jotham then became co-regent for about 10 years. And so you had Uzziah sitting in his house by himself, but he's still the king. But his son Jotham is administering the government, and he's the king as well. I mean, he has just as much authority, and him and dad are working together. And by that way, he develops his own system of support because people respected his father, and therefore, since his father's put him in charge, they respect him. By the time his dad dies, everything's going smoothly in him. Great transitional thing. So it's very likely that that's what's going on with Belshazzar as well, when he's this second ruler. And in fact, we know from history what happened was Nabonidus liked to build temples. And he liked to go off and do that. And so he goes off to build the temple and leaves his son in charge of Babylon while he's off with an army and workers building this temple over in this other location. And this is when the Persians came. Is while he's off doing that. And so we'll talk about that a little more when we get to that chapter. Darius the Mede, again, people are not sure who he is. There's a lot of debate whether he's Cyrus and Darius is his Median name and Cyrus was his Persian name, or if he was a general under of Cyrus. I think that's who. I think that's a better option. That there was a general named Dalmata. That when Cyrus captured Babylon, he put him in charge, and he could have designated him the king of Babylon. He'd just be a sub-king under Cyrus. That'd be no big deal. He'd be somebody trusted. He's not going to lead a revolt. Now, the problem we have is that this guy only lasted about a year and died of old age. And the events in Daniel involving Darius last longer than that. So it may have been his replacement, the next guy in line or something like that. There's not enough information right now to clarify. That's the big thing to understand. But he is a historical person, and we're just not 100% sure who he is. One of the other fun things, of course, is the madness again of Nebuchadnezzar, and we'll talk a little bit more about that, what its nature is, and how legitimate it is. Okay, date of composition. Again, I believe it's written in the 6th century, about 3 years after the Persians were conquered, because that's about the time of Daniel in the lion's den. So it had to be after that event. So that would, that would put it around 535, 536, something like that. And so that would be considered, the early composition. I don't think 2nd century. Again, this is one of the things to check in commentaries. When you're looking at a commentary, you ought to check with that section of the commentary and what the author says about the date, because that's going to tell you volumes about their view of Scripture. Now, the theme of Daniel, I believe, is God's sovereign control. Again, his control of history, his control of men, his control of nations, however you want to define it. But God's sovereign control. And the basic thrust of the book is his sovereign control of men in history is seen in the protection and blessing of his own, and then also in the discipline and destruction of both Gentile kings and kingdoms. So you see God exercising his sovereign all the way down to the personal level as well as at a universal level. And this is really the way God's sovereignty works. Now, we often forget that. And we think, even on our national level, where do we stand? But our nation is just one little piece in a greater plan. God is working worldwide. Sometimes we forget that. We think of the third world as just out there, a good missionary place, but we're the center of attention. We may not be. In fact, I think more and more Asia is becoming God's center of attention. Maybe we were for a while, but I don't know that we are anymore. We're following Europe and becoming has-been Christianity. And God has always been at work worldwide. And we are not the center of attention. We never were. God his focus has been on the whole population of the whole earth. And yes, we're wealthy and we got great technology and things like that. But that villager out there in the middle of the jungle is just as significant to God as one of us is. And God is just as active in that little village as he is in our cities. The divine perspective, I think, is very different from ours. And so God is involved, again, at a personal level, at a national level, at an international level, and he's accomplishing things. That's one of the challenges of figuring out the present world situation. What does God really want to accomplish? And what is our place in it? We can only act based on what we know, but we don't know, even if we'll be here 10 years from now. We're at the zenith of our power, and if you look at history, and if history repeats itself, that means we're in big trouble. Because no empire has lasted more than about 40 or 50 years after they reached the zenith of their power, after they became the world power. They're usually gone soon after that. I mean, Nebuchadnezzar's empire only lasted 70 years. I mean, and it was just a flash in the pan of history. The Assyrian Empire lasted much longer than that, a couple of 300 years, but still, they don't last very long. And the Assyrian Empire, again, it reached the zenith of its power and then was soon gone. And same thing, the Babylonian Empire, the Greek Empire. I mean, Alexander the Great, he conquers the world and then it's all gone. Roman Empire. That was one of the big mistakes that the Jews made in the revolt in both 70 AD and 135. Is they picked a time when Rome was its most powerful. Of course, that was God's doing. And the interesting analysis, though, some people are convinced now that the Jews actually had a chance to win. They could have succeeded because they were really good fighters. But they were so busy fighting each other that by the time they were finished killing each other off, there wasn't anyone left to fight the Romans. And Jerusalem fell because of that. Because they were running around burning up each other's food supplies. So the Romans just sat there, grinned, and waited, and then came in when everything was done. By the time they came in, the Jews had piles of dead bodies from killing each other. Of course, that's God's design. Now, key people in Daniel. One of the key things, of course, is in these books, recognize them. Of course, you've got Daniel, you've got Shadrach, Meshach, and to bed we go. And when we get real tired. You've got Nebuchadnezzar, Belshazzar, and Darius. It's interesting, you've got 4 Jews and 3 Gentiles. three kings play key roles in understanding the message of the book. Well, let's start working our way through. In Daniel chapter 1, whichever approach you take, it introduces us to the story, and you've got Daniel and his three friends taken captive into Babylon. Now, let's put this in its historical perspective. When did this happen? What date?
Babylon first tried to conquer 605?
605. 605. 605 BC. What has happened? Josiah has just died in battle. Okay, Josiah just died in battle. Pharaoh Necho took his army up to Carchemish. And if you know anything about Carchemish, from the Pharaoh's side of things, it was a disaster. Basically what had happened is the Babylonians had gotten their independence, they're pushing, and the Assyrians made their last stand at Carchemish. Haran had fallen, Ashur had fallen, Nineveh had fallen, everything had fallen, so they made their last stand. Now, the Egyptians and the Assyrians had been fighting each other for years and years and years. But the Egyptian Pharaoh recognized that their only hope of protection against the Babylonians was to keep some vestige of the Assyrian Empire alive as a buffer. And that's why he goes up to help them. Not because he loved them or he cared about them, because he'd been fighting them for years, but because he needed them to be around. Of course, they get wiped out. The Babylonians just slaughtered. And so, but when he comes back, he has defeated the Israelites, the Jews, by killing Josiah in battle. Why would Josiah try to stop him from going to Carchemish?
They were allied, were trying to be allied with Babylon.
That's right. Hezekiah had made a treaty and Josiah was keeping it. I mean, that's really the bottom line. What he should have done was stayed in Jerusalem and held out till the Babylonians came to rescue him. That's what he should have done. Because that's always was God's command. Just stay out of the world affairs and I'll protect you. But he didn't, and it cost him his life. Now, when Pharaoh came back, his son had been made king, and Pharaoh took him prisoner and appointed his own replacement king, a puppet king, who was a son of Josiah, Jehoiakim. Okay, and so then right behind him comes Nebuchadnezzar. Interesting enough, at this time Nebuchadnezzar's not king yet. His dad is still alive. And he's just a general. Now his dad dies soon after that. But Nebuchadnezzar comes down, and the city surrenders to him, and he then leaves Jehoiakim in charge. He's also known as Jeconiah. No, that's Jehoiachin, Jeconiah. And so he then takes prisoners of the children of the leaders. And that's what he does. This first deportation is basically hostages. And some of the leaders, some of the leading people, but this first group that's taken are basically hostages. Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego are part of that group. They're the sons of royal officials and royal family members. Now we're not told who their parents were, but they are somehow related to key people. And so Daniel would have come from the upper class group. They arrive there, and what gets done to them? Yeah, they get castrated, because they're made eunuchs to serve in the palace. And their names are changed. Now, the significance of a name change is authority. And if you notice, their names are changed to match up Babylonian gods, and each one of them had names that were identified with Yahweh. Yeah. And Daniel, Azariah, Mishael. So they were apparently kids from godly parents who had named them with a divine name, and they're committed. Now, so you have all these different things that happen, and of course you're familiar with the story. They're given the king's food, which was a good thing, but it's primarily meat and wine. You know, the Atkins diet. And now, what's the problem of the king's food?
Most likely would have been served to idols.
Yeah, it would have been offered to idols. It would be meat sacrificed to idols, and very unlikely that it would have been prepared kosher. You know, not drained the right way, and all those kinds of things. So they make the choice not to defile themselves. Now, I find it interesting because they're trusting God, and their approach was that rather than rebelling, rather than being blatant, rather than surrendering, because there were probably a bunch of other Jewish boys in their same condition who just simply blended in. They don't get mentioned. They arrived too. It wasn't just these 4 got put into the king's service. There's probably dozens of them. And the rest decided we'll just blend in. But they made the choice not to. But they didn't do it in a blatant, rebellious way. What did they do?
Permission.
Yeah, they asked permission. And, you know, the eunuch in charge of them, he took a big risk. Notice what he said. You know, if you don't look good, I lose my head. Why? Because that's the way Nebuchadnezzar operated. You know, Saddam Hussein was not all that bad of a leader. In fact, he was a pretty brilliant guy. Because in that part of the world, that's the way you lead. I have to tell a story about Saddam. Before he invaded Kuwait, one of the guys who defected from his government tells this story. That before he invaded Kuwait and all this, he called in his generals, and all of his advisors, sitting around a table from him. And he gives them this grand plan for what he's going to do. And when he's done, he says, now, I want you all to tell me if it's a good idea or a bad idea. Don't just be yes men. I want to know, because if there's something wrong with my idea, someone needs to tell me. So I want y'all, you know, if anyone has any questions, tell me. And one of the guys says, well, you know, I see a problem. Anybody else have a problem with my plan? I mean, he really did do that. That's, in that part of the world, that's good leadership. And that's the way Nebuchadnezzar led. So when this guy says, you know, if you don't look good, I die, he wasn't joking. If you got called in to see the king, you didn't know if you're coming out alive. And even if you thought things were good, and he got in a bad mood while you were there, it was over. You know, and of course, what was Nebuchadnezzar's, one of his favorite ways of dealing with people who irritated him? Yeah, he invited them to the big barbecue pit. As Ezekiel put it, he roasted them in the fire. You know, and a very vicious guy. And so this guy is frightened. Now, he agrees to the plan for just 10 days. And they're eating vegetables. How easy is it to gain weight eating vegetables? No, not very easy. And they didn't have good salad dressing back then. I ate a salad at school. And with one ladle of salad dressing in a bowl about this big. So I get all that healthy lettuce, and, you know, and all those things, and then I make sure I've balanced it out.
Protein's in the
That's
blue
right.
cheese.
Yeah, that's right. There's protein in there somewhere. And but, you know, yeah, and God, of course, sovereignly intervenes. And I think the point of this chapter is, again, that God takes care of His own. They trusted Him. They didn't rebel, but they did put in a situation, and God worked in the heart of the men to allow them to do this test, and they did better. They were healthier, their skin was better. Well, why? Well, if you eat a pure meat diet, it's pretty rough on you anyway. And this is not teaching that vegetarianism is good. I mean, that's not the point of the chapter. Because, in fact, God permitted the Jews to eat meat, and it was a part of the sacrificial system and a part of having fellowship with God. So it wasn't the fact that they weren't eating meat. It was the fact that they were obeying the Lord, and God intervened on their behalf. The readers of their day would have known, eating vegetables? I mean, you're not going to gain weight eating vegetables. I mean, even eating beans, you're not going to do that well. It just gets smelly. But so we see in this chapter that God does protect them. He blesses them. And then what happens intellectually? They grow and stimulate, and they're some of the smartest kids in the group. And Nebuchadnezzar recognizes that. And the eunuch in charge of them goes, whew, survived this 3-year tour. And because it's for 3 years that they're doing this. So you're going from about 605 to 602, 601 BC. Is when all this happens.
It's interesting that what God requires of us isn't necessarily the same every generation or between each one of us. I mean, I'm not trying to rationalize anything, but any kind of behavior.
Yeah.
But He does demand different. And maybe wouldn't you say it has something to do with the custom? It prevails?
Some of it. There's a righteous way to live within any given culture. I think there are universal righteous rules. For example, not murdering, not stealing. Mm-hmm. But there are, even within cultures, there are the right way of doing things and the wrong way of doing things. And it does vary from culture to culture. I mean, that's a part of the tension we have now in a multicultural society like we have. It's really the clash of worldviews, not the clash of races. And it's a clash of values and all that. And some of the things are neutral. Now, some of them are a matter of Judeo-Christian heritage. Our values are biblically based and theirs aren't. But sometimes it is just a preference of how things are done. So, now, chapter 2, we have the dream of the statue. Nebuchadnezzar has a dream. And here's the difficult thing that I have with this. In the chapter, the real point of the chapter is the fact that God, again, takes care of His own. I think that's the real point of the chapter. Because, again, how's the story go? Nebuchadnezzar has his dream. He has a dream of a statue. Got the 4 metals. He calls his soothsayers together. Says, I had a dream. My name's not Martin Luther King. So, therefore, you got to figure it out. And so he doesn't tell them what the dream is. They have to tell him. Now, what we know of the Babylonian Chaldean group is that apparently what they had was they had a manual that they used to interpret dreams. And so you would tell them what you dreamed, and they would check out the manual and they'd tell you the meaning. Okay. Nebuchadnezzar has just come to power recently. His dad has died, and he's now in power. And one of the challenges that ancient kings had is that your power base involved the priesthood of the religion. And there may have been a struggle between Nebuchadnezzar and the priests for control. And these Chaldeans would be a part of this religious system. The Chaldeans were an ethnic group. They had come down to Babylon from modern-day Syria, from Chaldea, and they had taken over Babylon. And so they were not true Babylonians, ethnically. They were foreigners who come in and taken over, and they were known as the Chaldeans. So Nebuchadnezzar was a Chaldean, not a Babylonian. Okay, the Babylonians were the local people, farmers and all that kind of stuff that had been taken over. The Chaldeans was also a class of people within Nebuchadnezzar's government. So in fact, later on, Daniel's going to be referred to as a Chaldean because he was in that class of people. And these guys were the priests and the government officials and prophets, astrologers, that category of people. So they performed magic. They did, all kinds of. They would be the magicians. So they were a class of people that involved the Babylonian religions as well. And there was some kind of a struggle. Now, Nebuchadnezzar can't jump up and say, I'm getting rid of all the priests. But he can make a demand of them, and if they can't come through with it, then he can get rid of them. I mean, that's the whole point. And so this may have been a strategy on his part, is to get an excuse to wipe out some of the people who were opposing him. Get rid of this power base that is threatening him. That's a possibility. But he makes the demand. They, of course, tell him, tell us the dream, we can give the answer. He says, nope, you got to tell me the dream and the answer. So then he knows. Now, some people theorize, well, maybe he'd forgotten the dream, and he's trying to get him to spur his memory. Probably not. That's not the Nebuchadnezzar that I see in history. It's probably more, he's strategizing here, and he's got him over the barrel. And again, he's not the kind of guy that's going to make an empty threat. He's going to kill them all if they don't produce. And so we have this situation where Daniel and his friends are identified with this class of people, and so they will die along with the rest because they can't fulfill the demand of Nebuchadnezzar. And so, as one aspect of the message of this chapter is that God then intervenes, giving Daniel the interpretation, so that through that, God accomplishes two things. Number one, he saves Daniel's life. Daniel and his three friends. And number two, what does he do?
And exalting Daniel and his friends.
Yeah, he positions Daniel and his friends in the government, where they can then...
Kind of the same way as Joseph.
That's right, just like happened with Joseph. So they can then take care of God's people. Now, remember, 605, Babylon fell. 3 years later, Daniel goes to work. 602, 601. 597 is when the next conquest of Jerusalem is going to occur. Okay. Jehoiachin rebels, and when he's defeated by Nebuchadnezzar, he's taken to Babylon as a prisoner and replaced with Zedekiah, who will last 11 years until he rebels. And Jehoiachin, who is also known as Jeconiah or Coniah, will go into captivity and later on be blessed by God and stay a part of the Messianic line. But at this time, at the time that this dream has occurred, and the time that Daniel is elevated, it appears to be just before this conquest. So see this God's strategic placement of Daniel, because what's going to happen now? Thousands of Jewish prisoners are going to be brought back to Babylon and planted throughout the cities. And they're the intelligentsia, they're the artisans, and the skilled people, and the leaders. So in the second fall of Jerusalem now, about 10,000 of the best people in Judah get hauled off. And Daniel's going to be in a position to take care of them. In fact, some people theorize that he was actually there in part of the deportation. And that this occurred at the time of the statue. When Nebuchadnezzar makes the statue and demands that the Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego bow to it. That actually Daniel's off doing this task. We don't know that. But we do know that he has this dream. Now I think that's the purpose of the chapter, to show that God preserved his people by providing Daniel the interpretation of the dream. But within the chiasm, this is, again, the vision of the kingdoms that parallels chapter 7. So, one of the significant things in this chapter, by the way, is the occurrence of the term the kingdom of heaven in chapter 2, verses 44 and 45. This is probably where Jesus took the phrase that he uses in the gospel, the kingdom of heaven is like. So here you have a reference to the kingdom of heaven in Daniel chapter 2. Now, again, the statue, 4 different metals. What are they and what's the significance?
The more conservative view.
Yeah. Well, again, the liberal view is Babylon, Media, Persia, and Greece. That's the 4 according to the liberals. The conservative view, it's Babylon, Medo-Persia, silver, Greece, the bronze, and then Rome, the iron. Now, a lot is made of the 10 toes. this is one of the places where then Hal Lindsey came up with the idea that you'd have this 10-nation confederacy at the end and all this kind of stuff. Yeah, it does mention the 10 toes, so maybe there is a significance to that, but maybe not. Some people say, well, you know, it's 2 legs, so it's the Eastern Roman Empire and the Western Roman Empire.
They split.
And they split. Yeah, I think that's beginning to read just a little too much into it.
Wouldn't you see something corresponding with that other places in Scripture, if that was really
Yeah.
what was intended by the
Yeah.
author?
I think so. Now, there is a reference that there's going to be a certain number of kings and all this kind of stuff. In Revelation, there's some talk about that. So, there is some indications. But here's where you have to be careful of how far you take symbolic language. But it's very clear, 4 empires. And it's very clear that the 4th empire has mixed strength and weakness at the end. It's very clear that the kingdom of heaven, symbolized by this big rock, is going to wipe out everything at the end of the 4th empire. Now, some interpreters take that to mean the church wiped out the Roman Empire.
The
4th century.
The Roman Empire was really never conquered. I mean, there's no battle in history where somebody...
Yeah, but the church sort of grew, and the Roman Empire disappeared, and the church replaced
it.
it.
Just assimilated.
Yeah, see, the problem is the Roman Empire is still here.
Yeah, just assimilated.
Yeah, it's
into
not
the
gone
culture.
yet. That's right. And so, I believe this rock is a reference again to the coming of Messiah's kingdom, at which time all these other empires and their history will be completely obliterated. Right now, in fact, one of the indications of the statute is that each of the empires continues on in some form. And it's true. You still have vestiges of the Babylonian Empire in the Middle East, and the Persian Empire, and the Greek Empire, and you know, the people groups and all that kind of stuff, the Roman Empire. They're all still here. So they haven't been obliterated. And the slow growth of the church is not what is pictured by this rocket and everything is dashed to dust. So the point of the vision is there's going to be these 4 empires between then and the end, or actually, you know, the first one was already in place. But there's going to be these 4 empires, and then they'll be replaced by Messiah's kingdom. That's what the Jews needed to know from this vision. Now, here's the interesting thing. How is, because we're told the Golden Empire was the superior one, and you see they get more and more inferior metals. The metals are harder, but less valuable, rougher. So how is the Babylonian Empire greater than the Persian Empire? Because the Persian Empire was much bigger, and the Greek Empire was even bigger.
Yeah, but people argue the magnificence of Babylon. I mean, what they built, there was so much value. Gold indicates the value of the empire, not necessarily the size.
Yeah, culturally, you know, the Persian Empire was a very cultured empire, but apparently Babylon, yeah, it was. It was phenomenal. Not just their architecture, but the society that they built. Because Nebuchadnezzar was brilliant. By bringing in the best minds, the brain drain of all the countries he conquered, and putting them in his government and having them, I think he really did develop a well-advanced society. And that the people benefited greatly. And so, we have that situation then. And so, but in this chapter, you see the double duty of the chapter. On one hand, it's continuing the theme of the 2-part division, God taking care of men. But on the other hand, it also introduces the chiasm, God's sovereign control of history, and God's plan for history. So it's a difficult thing with that chapter. And there again, that's why I think in some ways maybe Daniel intended both aspects to be recognized: the 2-part division and the chiasm within the book.
So you think it was intellectual? The goal is intellectual brilliance rather than wealth.
I think it was cultural brilliance.
Cultural.
Governmental brilliance. His was the best of all the governments. And his society was probably the best of all the societies. The Persians who took over were pretty good, but they just weren't at the same level. And then, of course, the Greeks was even less, and the Romans were just brutal, which we see in the division of the beasts. See that. Well, let's take a pause here. And again, depending on one's view, it's in the middle of the individual history section, or it's in the second phase of chiasm, where you have the story of the fiery furnace. Again, very familiar story. Something to know about this, that these furnaces, they have actually found some now and excavated them. These furnaces were about the size of a high school gym. Okay, they're about 2 stories high, as we would think, and about the size of a gymnasium.
Now, were they used for
They were
just torturing people, or were they
no,
actually?
they were
used
brick
for-
kilns.
Oh, really? Okay.
Brick kilns. And what they did was, you had this large building, and it had 2 floors.
Right.
It had a middle floor, and it had vent holes through the floor and all that, and it was vented in such a way, and they would put their bricks on the second floor to dry, and they would stuff wood on the first floor, and then they'd light it and burn it. And the heat from the fire on the first floor would go up into the second floor and bake the bricks. And we're talking 600-700 degrees, 1,000 degrees temperature. Now, the temperature would vary in different parts of the thing, but it'd all be at least 600 degrees. I mean, it's hot as blazes, mostly because it was blazing. And then they would have a ramp to that floor that they would take the stuff in and out. So when these guys are thrown in, apparently what they did was Nebuchadnezzar set up his pavilion where he could watch. They build the fire below, and it says in text that they made it 7 times hotter. In other words, they made it as hot as they possibly could. They made it in a blast furnace. And so he's watching from on top to see these guys die. He wants to see them curl up and burn, is what it really boils down to. It's so urgent, we're told that his soldiers die in the process of throwing them in. How does that happen? Well, if you've ever messed with a fireplace and you open up the door too fast, yeah, you have this flash fire because the heat hits the oxygen, and it'll be a blast. And probably that's what happened to these guys. Their last dying effort was to throw these 3 men in, and they died in the process. And they would, even though the first group died, the second and third group wouldn't hesitate to do the same thing because of their loyalty to the king. You did what the king said, even if it meant dying. That's the way they thought. We would think twice about it, but they wouldn't.
But you're gonna die anyway, right?
Yeah, you're going to die. If you don't do it, the king kills you, so you might as well just, make a name for yourself. This kind of loyalty, which we're not used to, it is illustrated well by Napoleon, of all people. He was entertaining some guy one time, and he decided to show the guy just how loyal his men was to him, and he ordered a unit to march off a cliff. And they did, to the man. If that's what Napoleon wants us to do, that's what we'll do. It's amazing to think of how people think. But they do that. But these furnaces were really something. And the blast that would come from it would be a significant blast of heat. Now, of course, liberal scholars, there have actually been people who've said that what happened is when they were thrown in, they landed into a cool spot in their mouth. If they don't deny that it even happened, they say, well, they landed a cool spot like 400 degrees.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Isn't that ridiculous?
I mean, the whole point of the passage is it was so hot their bonds were vaporized. Their bonds burned off, but they weren't burned. And when they came out, they didn't smell. Now, other theories is that this statue that he demands people worship was a result of the dream of the statue. Now, the nature of the statue, it's described as being basically 9 feet wide and 90 feet tall. And it's a golden statue. Most likely, in fact, couldn't have been solid gold. There wasn't and still isn't that much gold in the world. But more likely what it was a wooden statue, a board, relatively flat, elongated, covered in gold plate. That was a common way of doing king statues during that time period. So very likely that's what it is. The plains of Dura, we're not 100% sure where it is. There's several places called Dura. There is one place that's about 5-6 miles outside of the city of Babylon, in an area, in a valley that's a low, a fairly smooth but low valley. And the way it's positioned, it would actually make it seem even more significant. And it would be on this Dura was a platform, a square or a rectangular platform built sort of like a high place, brick platform on which the statue would stand. So it's very likely that they have found the place, even though they can't prove it because it fits all the description.
So the gold isn't still there?
No. So that's not one of the things to go looking for. Now, that being said, the question is asked, well, why would Nebuchadnezzar do this? Well, again, you got an ego that won't quit. But also, many think that it could have been a test of loyalty. Again, if you're going to bow to the king, you're loyal. If you're not, you're not. Well, of course, the problem with Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego is Scripture commands otherwise. They're not to worship. So they choose not to. Now, let's ask this question. Did they anticipate surviving?
Well, not really.
Yeah, it's really
as if we are. God can, but we don't know that He will.
Yeah.
And whether He does or He doesn't, we're not going to do it.
Yeah, and that's the key. Their faith was such that they were convinced God could deliver them. They didn't know if He would. Yeah, they weren't banking on it, but they had already determined whether He did or not. They were going to remain loyal to Him to the bitter end. So you see their faith. So they're not expecting to die, but they're also not expecting to survive. That would be one way to describe it. Now, again, what is their attitude towards the king?
Respect.
Yeah, they're respectful. They're firm. Sorry, king, we're not going to worship you. But they refer to him with terms of respect. They're not rebellious. They're not belligerent. And they're still following the pattern we saw in chapter 1. Now, the reason this is important is because we need to think in those terms. That there are going to be times when we have to confront the government or other people, and we need to be careful how we do it. Because God's reputation is at stake there as well. And you can be firm without being belligerent. I mean, this is an area where I struggle because I'm a fighter. I know how to fight. I know how to surrender. I don't know how to go in between. And yet there is that in between. They were firm, but again they didn't compromise. Now Nebuchadnezzar casts them into the furnace. They're delivered. He sees a fourth person with him, which is possibly Jesus, a theophany. Possibly because he refers to him as a son of the gods. So people take that as a code to be the son of God, or an indication. But it could also simply have been an angel sent to minister to them. The text doesn't tell us who it is.
Just recognizes it as a spiritual being.
That's right.
For the most part.
Now, what the liberals say, maybe they had an insider helping them find out.
No, they don't. They don't come up with anything like that. No. And but they are delivered. But here's an important thing. Again, you see God's sovereign control. The whole point is not just that He delivered His own. He protected them individually. But what is the end result of their taking their stand and God intervening?
Well, King's
Oh,
mind
God
was
is
changed
sovereign.
somehow.
Yeah, the king's mind has changed. And notice, he exempts the Jews from worshiping him or Babylonian gods. He gives the Jews the right to worship Yahweh only. And in fact, this is an interesting pattern in history. God did this for the Jews several times. You have it here.
Esther.
You have it in Esther with Mordecai. You have it under Alexander the Great. When he was going to conquer the Persian Empire and he was approaching Jerusalem, the Jerusalem leadership went out and welcomed him and told him about Daniel's prophecy and told him, you're going to win. And he not only did not conquer Jerusalem, of course they surrendered to him, but he made them tax exempt. And he made Judaism and the temple in Jerusalem tax exempt. He gave them special status. And he gave them the right to worship Yahweh only. Then later on, when the Romans take over, you have a similar situation because of Jewish help and things like that. God intervenes, and the Romans give the Jews the right to worship Yahweh only, even though they consider that atheism. So each step through history, God gave them the command, but he also created circumstances that the end result was they were enabled by God to obey that command. And so that was a part of the purpose of these guys facing this situation. Is God was working through them to accomplish an even greater good. Now they weren't aware of that at the time. They were just simply living for the Lord. So that's chapter 3. Now chapter 4 we move to the situation of the dream of the tree. Nebuchadnezzar has another dream. He dreams about a tree. It's a big tree. All the birds are dwelling in it. The animals are nourished by it. And then it gets cut down by the angel and iron band put around it. And of course they eventually call for Daniel to interpret it. And the interpretation is?
Your aggregation. You're going to be cut down.
Yeah. But you're going to be restored after 7 years, or 7 periods. And you're going to be crazy, and you're going to be put out to pasture, literally. Now, what is his disease? Did you know that they have actually identified the mental illness that he had? Boanthropy. Thought he was a cow.
It's a real disease.
Yeah, it is a real disease that does exist. And you'll find in some of the commentaries, they'll talk about the fact that we do have recorded cases of boanthropy. There was a guy in England that thought he was a cow. He went crazy, and they thought he was a cow, and he was in an asylum. And they let him out to graze every day, and he literally crawled on his hands and knees and ate grass all day long like a cow. I mean, the guy really thought he was a cow. And his hair, because of the nutritional problems created by that, his fingernails became claw-like. It affected his fingernails, and it affected his hair, and it became feathery. Just as is described with Nebuchadnezzar. Now, that raises another problem, though. How does Nebuchadnezzar survive 7 years grazing, completely mad, and then get the kingdom restored to him?
To be protected.
They have to be protected. And he said, well, God protected them. Well, how did God do it? What are some of the possibilities? Let's just think about that.
It might have, his adversaries even might have put him on exhibit in a sense. Put a choker on him and
But
just
see,
turn around and
but
shoot
in their world, they would just kill him off because you don't give him a chance.
As an example of,
No, there's no indication that anybody else knew about it.
they may have humiliated him, and then when God decided the time was ready, they were killed off instead, and he stood up and, whoa, what a dream.
I don't know that it works that way. One possibility is this, is that his son served as co-regent.
They probably needed the milk.
And so, needed the milk, But, it could be that his son just simply functioned as co-regent and no one would notice. They would just assume that that's what he's doing and Dad's taking a vacation. He's so far removed back in his palace that the average person would never know anything happened anyway. There may only have been a handful of people who knew. Apparently he was really loved and respected. And so maybe they were willing to live with his insanity. Another possibility is that Daniel just simply continued to run the government and waited out.
Well, I mean, where with Daniel's interpretation, there came a frame of time where this is going to happen, but you will be restored.
That's right. There's
You
that
know,
promise.
Here's a previous interpretation that saved everybody's butt, making ones before. So,
Yeah.
Always
Right.
listen to him. Well, 7 years or however long it's been,
Yeah.
that 7-term period that he's talking about. We'll wait it out and
See what happens.
If the guy freaks out and goes back, then we'll do something else. But
Yeah. So, we have a situation where he does survive. Now, again, scholars have questioned this, but there is the report of Nabonidus' illness. And so there is actually a record of one king who talked about becoming ill for a period of time and things like that, but nothing like this. Again, the point of the chapter is, even the most powerful man, God can humble. Because remember, he was warned because of his injustice and his pride. And it's in the moment that he looks around and says, look at all that I've accomplished. God gets him. And notice it's the angelic watcher who gets him. Again, the angelic interpreter.
it would make sense that we wouldn't find a whole lot of historical reference to his problem because he wouldn't want anybody to know what happened.
That's right. And you don't write about the bad stuff. It's like a story I like to tell. There was a battle between the Assyrians and the Egyptians at one point, where something like 90% of both armies died. I mean, they just slaughtered each other. Both kings reported it as a great victory. But it was such a bad battle, such a devastating battle. Both retreated. Neither won. It was a draw. That's what it really was. But they both reported it as a victory. You don't report your failures. And so it's not surprising that we don't have a record of his madness. Maybe someday if they gather up all the records, they'll have a time period where all of a sudden his signature disappears for a while or something like that. But even then, his son could simply take a signet ring and sign things for him. So it would appear that he's functioning. And so somehow he is covered, and God humbles him and then restores him. And the whole point is God is sovereignly in control. Now, from this we move then to the other example of God's sovereign control over pagan kings, and that is the handwriting on the wall, chapter 5. You have the Feast of Belshazzar. And again, the text we're familiar with. He has this feast. He calls for the vessels of the temple to be brought out of storage, and they're eating and drinking using these vessels that were supposed to be used in the worship of God. And he's doing this with his concubines and his friends when the handwriting comes on the wall. And of course the humor there talks about how he got so scared that his knees knocked together. And you may not notice, but people do get that scared. When I did my little sister's wedding, my brother-in-law, now brother-in-law, he was all cool, calm, and collected. And we thought my sister would just be a basket case. We're thinking, man, is she going to go wacko or what? And thought he's going to be cool as a cucumber because he's always so overconfident. And so we get to the wedding, and I'm supposed to do the vows. I got to be the preacher, and so I'm going to do the vows, and I asked him. I said, "You want me to do it just line by line, phrase by phrase, or whole sentences?" He said, "Whole sentences." He says, "Maybe I should just do phrases." And it's real funny. My sister was cool as a cucumber. I mean, she just relaxed and just enjoyed it and handled it. He, on the other hand, he gets there, and I hear this knocking sound, and it's his knees knocking. And so I'm supposed to begin it. I go, well. So I read the first line. Do you repeat after me? I, Ralph Woods, take you, Sarah Derickson, to be my lawfully wedded wife. And he looks at me and goes, oh.
Not so fast.
And we broke it down into little phrases for him. So it was really funny how, but literally his knees were knocking. You hear this knocking sound. You look down, and whack, 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 whack. And that's what's going on with Belshazzar. I mean, his hips go loose. I mean, he is really scared silly when he sees this. Of course, it's written in Hebrew, not in Aramaic. The words are in Hebrew, and Daniel ends up interpreting them. This is where also we find out that very likely, because Daniel tells them, your father Nebuchadnezzar. You should have known better because you saw what happened to your father Nebuchadnezzar. He reminds them of chapter 4 and what had been experienced by Nebuchadnezzar. So he should have known better. But now the question is, why is he drinking from the vessels of the temple? What's going on?
Pride, isn't it?
Yeah, there's some pride and arrogance. Because of this. In Isaiah, whose prophecy he would have access to, who did Isaiah say was going to conquer Babylon and release the Jews? Cyrus. Guess where Cyrus is right now?
He's outside digging a trench,
Yeah, he's
damming up the river.
That's right. He's outside digging a trench and damming up the river, getting ready to come underneath the walls and take the city. Yeah. Now, of course, Belshazzar doesn't know that, but he does know Cyrus is out there. Now, historically, what had happened again is Nabonidus had gone off to build that temple, and he left Belshazzar in charge, second ruler of the nation, co-regent. When the Persians approached, Nabonidus found out about it and intercepted them, but lost the battle. He didn't make it back to Babylon in time. He couldn't get back to the city, so he had to fight them, and he lost and was captured. And so Cyrus, what he does is he came up with a strategy, and they build a camp besieging the city, but it's all dummies. And just a small crew to build fires and make it look like they're there. But in reality, he's taking his army back to build the trench, to redirect the river. Now, the challenge that Cyrus faced was this. The city of Babylon was several square miles in size. Anyone know the size of its walls?
They were 90 feet thick. I know that used to race chariots across the top.
Yeah, they could handle like 2 or 3 chariots across the top.
160 feet high, too, weren't they?
Yeah, they were humongous.
Yeah. And the river...
And they went deep. They went down, too.
And
They weren't just on the
it
surface.
was, what, 100 yards wide around the city.
Yeah, and then the river that went through the city, the wall came down to the river level, and on both sides of the river, the city was walled with gates. But so they always had fresh water and sewage clearance. So you didn't have the problem of what to do with all your waste. They had open areas where they could grow crops inside the city walls. So basically what they could do is simply shut the gates and wait them out. Not only not just live off their food supplies, but be continuing to grow crops. So, besiege us for the next 10 years. And in siege warfare, it was just as likely that the besieging army would be wiped out by disease as the city being besieged. In fact, that's why cities held out, because you hoped that they would, because they had poor sanitation, that they would be wiped out by disease before they could conquer you, and they'd have to give up and go home. And if they held out too long, though, then you ran out of food and you got diseases and everything, and you got wiped out. So whichever side, both sides are trying to accomplish that. And so, but see, he's got the prophecies of Cyrus's success, and I believe that the reason he calls for the vessels of the temple is he is thumbing his nose at God. That's what he's doing. He's saying, you can't get me. And I'm even going to insult you, just to let you know. My fortress is impregnable. I'm safe. You can't get me. And so it was a direct attack on God. Of course, you know from history what happened. Cyrus came under the walls. They hadn't closed the gates along the river because they didn't expect anybody. They walked right up into the city. The local residents basically go, the palace is over there. And there were a few soldiers that resisted for a very short time. Most weren't sober enough to resist. And the city fell without a fight. And they captured Belshazzar and executed him that night, exactly like Daniel says. It's in their records. And so it was fulfilled. God did not let him get away with it. And that's the point of this chapter. God's sovereignly in control. He determines who lives and dies, even amongst the world's most powerful men. Okay, well, pause while you change the tape.